Okay, hello and welcome, Dr. Mauro Zappaterra. I am so excited to be speaking with you today. I have recently come across your work about the cerebral spinal fluid, which is inspired by your interest in the Kundalini energy, as I get to know. And yes, I would love to hear a bit about your story, why that interests you, what is your background, and whatever you feel like sharing.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Um, the story really emerged quite naturally, to be honest with you. I didn't really have any i- insights or interests in Kundalini, to be honest with you. I just mostly had a curiosity of who we are as human beings. I was always interested in science and development, and you know, one of the first questions was how does a single cell, how does a fertilized egg become this multicellular, multi-dynamic being? And so I just started studying, the sciences, started studying molecular cell and developmental biology, and really started looking at, the cellular processes, the molecular processes that are occurring in the body, in cells, in tissues that make up organs that then come together to make up bodies, and then how these bodies come together and can function in such miraculous ways, and then how beings can come together and experience each other and have relationships and stuff like that. So that was always my interest, and it really came about from a process that my wife and I went through in Santa Fe. I was in medical school at the time, and I met my now wife, who sort of recognized that I wasn't doing so well. I was in probably a quite depressed space, and she said, you need to take some time off. We need to find, you need to find the reason you went to medical school in the first place, which was to find healing and to really be able to help people decrease suffering. And so she convinced me to take some time off, and we went to Santa Fe and we started studying together, all by her guidance, the healing arts, hands-on healing arts, including things like polarity therapy, Reiki, mostly looking at energies, energy medicine, acupuncture, things like that. And one of the things that we were introduced to was craniosacral therapy. And I was coming at it from a very Western scientific perspective, but still with this open curiosity of who we are, and a scientist, right? Where as a scientist, you're constantly exploring, you're constantly asking questions, you're constantly kind of in the unknown. Anytime we think we know something, it's that can be shattered quite easily. And even when I entered medical school, it was one of the first things they said is 50% of what you're going to learn in medical school is going to be wrong. And it's just what we hope to be able to teach you is, discernment, in terms of you have to figure out which 50% that is. And that's a really good starting point in terms of, when you're going out into the world and you're practicing with patients. You might see something on a textbook, and then that might be applied, but that information is being put together from the best data that we have, but that data or knowledge changes, and so you constantly have to be evolving and changing with that, and discerning based on your own clinical practice, based on other research, based on experience, based on a whole number of different things. And so I was always curious, right? So there's always this, well, can I feel something that's outside my body, right? Is there a sense of sort of a felt, is there something that when I'm approaching somebody, that can I tune my antennas, whatever sensory organs I use, right? At first I just thought it was like my fingers and toes and skin and stuff like that. But then I started recognizing that there are other sensory antennas that I didn't know what to call them, but I could perceive with other ways than just my skin or my eyes or my ears or my nose. And so that was really interesting to me of opening up certain interoceptive qualities that I felt like I had either shut down or had never been really asked to look at or to enhance, right? And so here we were sort of, looking at not only the physical body and making contact with the physical body, but then becoming more subtle with our touch and coming even, anybody who practices any sort of hands-on healing, knows it's sort of like you can be on the body, you can touch the bone, you can touch the muscle, you can touch the fascia, you can touch the skin, you can touch the fluids, and then you can, you kind of come off the body and be more ethereal and even be non-local. And that was sort of a development of what happened. Anyways, I was always curious, right? There's always this curiosity of, oh wow, I can feel something. And so when we were getting these sessions, this curiosity sort of continued and asking, still was the same question of how do we become human from a single cell, but then how does all this kind of function and work together? And then and I was in a craniosacral session, and I just sort of started feeling this pulsation of energy that was rising up it really felt like it was rising up my body, up my spine. But when I became more curious about it, it was really everywhere. It just seemed like it was coalescing. It almost seemed like it was aggregating along the spine, and it was rising up the spine, and it was pulsating and really strongly coalescing in the middle of in the middle of my brain. And because I had gone through medical school and had a sense of anatomy, I could try to localize it. And similarly, using that same curiosity of asking, where do I notice this energy? Right? Where, if I was to localize this anatomically, where would this be? And what can I, based on what I know, what could this energy be? Right? Which one would say, well, it's your heartbeat, it's your breathing, it's some sort of, some other rhythm. And so, as a sort of a good scientist, let's say, I continued to investigate that and say, is it my breathing, right? So I put my hand on my chest and noticed my breathing. I said, no, it's not my breathing. Put my hand, I actually remember, vividly putting my hand on both my carotid and radial pulse, because sometimes there's a slight variation between them. And, do I notice it? Is this my pulse from my heart? And it wasn't that. And so I just became really curious about this. And anatomically, when I localized it and I became curious about it, almost like a, I call it now kind of an open curiosity, a just almost as if you're resting your attention, you're allowing the energy to be there, and you're just sort of almost just watching it, right? Where would it localize itself? Where was it actually coalescing? And it was very clear. It was like, oh, this is my third ventricle. And I knew about the third ventricle, and I'm like, there's something going on in the third ventricle. And I didn't really, I didn't know, I mean, I knew anatomically, I probably know more than the average person because of going to like neuroscience and neuroanatomy classes and stuff like that. But it wasn't, I was like, wow, this is the third ventricle. It was pretty clear. And then even from there, going into the tissues on either side of the third ventricle, it was very midline. It was almost as if now, when I look back, where the third eye is depicted in many images or pictures. And so I started having this experience, and it became recurrent. So it just wasn't just a one-off, right? Because even that, it's sort of like, oh, it happened once, whatever that is. But it was recurrent. So it was something that was present, and it was very palpable. It was recurrent. It kept, coming back. It was something that could be felt. It felt like an energy of some sort, and so I became very interested in it, and again, similarly using that curiosity of what is this, and so I went to my teacher and I said, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. I'm not making this up. This is this is what I'm experiencing. And he just said, "Oh, you must be feeling the movement and the pulsations of the cerebrospinal fluid, the CSF." And I go, "Oh, like." And and so then again, going back to my medical school, I go, I'm not sure the CSF moves that much, sort of thing. And 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 um and so that night I went and I started, asking, what does the CSF do? Like, what do we know about this fluid, right? Here I am having this experience, and I know that the third ventricle is filled with this fluid, and he's saying, "Oh, you must be feeling the movement of this fluid," and so I go home and I just start, I go to PubMed, which is the NIH repository for published research, and I just start looking up, what does the cerebrospinal fluid do? And there was very little information on this fluid. We kind of thought it was it provided buoyancy to the brain. We knew it had some factors in it, but we didn't really know what it did. And mostly, it's sort of like if I got into an accident, it provided like a shock absorption for the brain, and that's kind of what we thought, and was a fluid medium for the brain, and and we didn't really know what it did, and he really sparked my curiosity because I'm like, well, if I'm feeling the movement of the fluid, kind of as a hypothesis, right? If I'm feeling this and it's recurrent and it's different than the heart and the breathing, then it must have it must have some function besides just providing buoyancy to the brain. There's got to be something else in that. And so that's really where I'm almost kind of fortunate because I was right in the middle of my MD PhD and I was trying to decide what to do my PhD on. And here comes this open, again, very curious, very open in terms of scientific world where you look for research and you say, wow, there's nothing here, which is sort of like just the open horizon is in front of you. It's like, wow, we can explore any part of this, right? So, so that was the beginning of a deeper dive into the cerebrospinal fluid, both from a practitioner slash experiential perspective, but also from a scientific perspective, looking at its function, trying to determine what it actually did, trying to describe it more clearly in terms of what's actually in it. How does it change? Is it stagnant or dynamic and things like that? And so I did my entire PhD on the cerebrospinal fluid while my wife and I were also going to study craniosacral in Boulder, Colorado. And so every 2 to 3 months, we'd leave Boston and go to Boulder and study biodynamic craniosacral therapy. And so it was really quite beautifully, divinely orchestrated, whoever may have been orchestrating that, because as I was studying this fluid from a very hardcore scientific perspective, I was also getting sessions of craniosacral therapy, and I was able to sort of investigate the fluid from a very experiential perspective, a very intimate experiential perspective, also as a client, right? Because I had to get sessions to go through these classes, which I think is very beneficial. But also, you give sessions in the class, so you're not only learning about this modality, and you're giving sessions and you're practicing, but you also need to get sessions from professionals who have already done it, so that you fully experience the work. And so, I was already in this sort of state of, when I would get the work, my energy and focus, it would coalesce in the third ventricle, and my awareness was going towards the cerebrospinal fluid as a fluid in the body. And as I was learning about it from scientific perspective of, even like connecting to the individual molecules that were in the fluid of the body, in the CSF. So it was kind of a really neat way of combining both, this experiential world that I was going through, and also a very hardcore scientific world. And And that was, the marriage of science and spirituality, as we say. And slowly, this hypothesis evolved. But it's always been, even when I talked to my PhD advisor, he said there's something mystical about the CSF that we just don't understand yet. And he's like he is a world-renowned geneticist, neurologist, developmental neuroscientist, and there's just something like uniquely spiritual about it, and and so you can come at it from whatever perspective you want, because anatomically we know that there's this fluid in the body. Not many people are aware of it. Many people become aware of it, unfortunately, when something bad happens, like you get an epidural and you have a CSF leak or something like that, and then the pressure changes in your head, and you start getting symptoms, and you're like, what is this fluid? Some people might notice it like dripping from their nose, whatever. Um, and so, you're not really aware of it, and yet through all the studies and connections that we've done, it's quite a it I call it it's quite an amazing fluid. And even if you just want to connect to it from a purely anatomical physical perspective, that's a great starting point to start to develop a relationship with this fluid of, we have a fluid. It's 99% water. It's in the middle of our brain. It's in the middle of our spinal cord. There's a central canal in the middle of our spinal cord. It goes all the way down. It bathes the outside of our spinal cord. It goes all the way into our sacrum. It bathes the outside of our brain, and that's it, right? So at that point, we're not like, anatomically we know that that's a fact. Now people are really starting to look at this fluid in terms of, what does it do? What are the you know what are its mechanics? How much does it actually move? And with the new imaging that has come out with MRI and functional MRI and MRI, that we can actually see small movements in water or fluid, we've actually been able to see this fluid actually move and be quite dynamic. So so now you could say, wow, this fluid does move. And if some people have the ability, more interoceptive qualities or abilities than others, that you might actually feel this fluid moving. If you don't, it's still one of those things that you can actually open up to and train and learn how to, and sort of be more open to the sensations that are occurring inside the body, even the really, really subtle ones that you might say, I don't feel that, because it's not so apparent. And as you sort of shift your focus or attention, you can start to develop that interoceptive quality or ability. And to me, it's almost like a filter, right? When you walk into a room, and let's say there's a loud fan going on in the filter, and that's all you're oriented to, that's all you're going to hear, right? But over time, if you go into the room and you start paying attention to other sounds, the fan actually might become, this loud kind of fan might become background, and you're able to sort of shift, right? And really kind of hone in on perceptive qualities that you want to hone into. And that's something that I think can be taught. I highly recommend people kind of learning that, and then, right, sensing and connecting with the fluid inside. So that's the basis of it from just a purely physical perspective. Is we have this fluid. Some people can feel their heartbeat, for instance. Sort of like, you can bring your attention to your heart and you have a relationship with that. This is just another body part that we can have a relationship with, that is in the middle, right? If you think about it, it's midline. It's like so perfectly midline. It goes all the way down, and there's a lake. fluid-filled cavity right in the middle of your brain and on both sides of your hemispheres of the brain, and it's filled with fluid. And so, even just stopping there and being like, wow, like that's pretty cool. What does it do, right? What does it do? And so then you can go down the path of, well, this is what we know it does. And over the last 15 years, the research on what we know it does has exploded. But
Okay.
just like with anything else, right? It's, well, what this is what we know it does, but the research continues. And so what could it do, right? What are the hypotheses of what it could do? And that's the exciting part is knowing what it does and where we were 30 years ago, where we are now, and where we could be, 50 years ago, or 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 150 years from now. And really it comes, a lot of it, because it's such a sacred fluid in the middle of your brain, it's really hard to get access to. And so this is really going to come out with new technologies that are being created that are able to assess this fluid and the movements of this fluid and how this fluid actually communicates or transmits information that is non-invasive, right? We don't need to take a probe and stick it into somebody in the middle of somebody's brain to investigate the fluid movements. And so trying to find non-invasive ways of studying this fluid, and that's what happened over the last 20 years. And now, because of the new imaging that came out. And so now we have to look 100 and 200 years from now of what is the technology that we're sort of working on to create now, that that the new studies will come out in 200 years ago that'll help us kind of continue to understand this fluid and what it does.
Amazing. You. Can you just help us pin down what do we know so far about the fluid, and also what were your findings and what are some of the beliefs you have around it so far that are not yet yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the exciting part. That's the exciting part of all of science is the hypotheses, and then going forward with testing those hypotheses and really coming up with good experiments to test those hypotheses. So what we found was, first of all, when we're in the womb, so a couple of things. In the womb, when we are in the womb, we are we're when the egg and the sperm come together and it starts to undergo development. There's a point in development where literally we're like a single layer sheet of cells. So if you could imagine just being a single layer sheet of cells, and you have fluid on top and you have fluid on the bottom of this single layer sheet of cells. That single layer sheet of cells then becomes a three layer. So it kind of invaginates and it makes three different layers. So imagine like a Neapolitan cake or something like that, right? Strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate. There's still fluid on the top and then fluid on the bottom. So you're totally developed. Embryologically in the womb, you are developing around fluid. You're being informed by fluid. Then what happens in this three-layered cake is there's a invagination that occurs, and as these cells go down, they also start to migrate, and they start to migrate. Many of them start to migrate up towards towards the heart and the brain, because you need to actually make the tissues you need to get the cells to the area that's going to make the brain. As it invaginates, what happens is that there's fluid here on the outside, on the top. As it invaginates, it actually forms a tube and it fuses around itself. And so the fluid on the outside is called the amniotic fluid, and the fluid on the inside, when the tube fuses, now we call that the cerebrospinal fluid. So one of the things that we brought to light was essentially developmentally, embryologically, the cerebrospinal fluid comes from the amniotic fluid. It's a derivative of the amniotic fluid in the womb. Okay, that fluid is informing the cells that invaginate and then that migrate. Right, so that's a movement of the cells that happens embryologically. Some people, when they're in deep states of meditation, trance, body work, whatever it might be, altered states, breathwork states, whatever, might actually feel these movements arising, or might have a connection back to that point in time through the connection with this fluid, in essence. Because the amniotic fluid gave rise to the cerebrospinal fluid, what I say is that there's a homeopathic, there's a vestige of amniotic fluid in our cerebrospinal fluid today. And so, and that fluid, essentially, if it has a quality or an ability to hold memory, then that'll have the memory of the entire embryo in it today, and that's very interesting. So that's number one, is that essentially the cerebrospinal fluid is derived from the amniotic fluid. Every single cell that makes up our nervous system, our central nervous system, is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid as a very, 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 very young embryo. As it differentiates, it leaves the connection with the cerebrospinal fluid and it becomes a neuron. So it starts to make the many cells of the brain and the other cells of the spinal cord and stuff like that. So it leaves the cerebrospinal fluid and it becomes a neuron. So one of the first things that we showed was that during development in the embryo, that the cerebrospinal fluid by itself actually has the properties of maintaining stem cellness and maintaining this pluripotency of the neuronal stem cells, that when they were making contact with the CSF, whatever the CSF had in it, the complete milieu, all the growth factors and hormones and electrolytes and sugar and all that stuff, all that was actually able to keep these cells as stem cells. When they moved away from the cerebrospinal fluid, then they became neurons, they became differentiated cells. So even that, right? Almost every time whenever I talk about science, what we know it's science, there's always a little bit of a, we always have to jump of, oh, that's interesting. You're more, there's a pluripotency, let's say, there's a totipotency, a pluripotency. There's more potential when you're actually close to the CSF, as opposed to then you remove yourself from the CSF. The cell moves itself from the CSF, it goes out to the periphery, and then it becomes more differentiated, right? So even like as we kind of think of a thought or an emotion, right? As we're close to the source, it could be anything. There could be anything that arises. As a thought or a wave emanates from that center, now it becomes differentiated, and it's sort of, oh, that's the, I had a thought about eating lunch or something like that. So now that cell becomes very, now it's sort of like, now this is in my right hemisphere and this is what it does. And it's very, it's very sort of localized and differentiated, as opposed to close to the source, close to the CSF. It's more potent. It has the capacity to become more other cells. So that's interesting too. So we found that. We also found that it's very dynamic. That it every day in development it changes, and it changes based on the information that the brain needs to grow. So not only is there pressure, the inside of the cavities, there's pressure, and that's actually helping keep this sort of brain open and expanding. So it's creating it. There's a little bit of an internal pressure. But it's also providing growth factors to the brain from the inside of the brain, bathing the neural stem cells and telling them what to do. Hey, we need to make more cells, right? Like, let's continue making more cells because we're still growing as a brain. And then it's sort of like there's sort of switches and mechanisms that turn on new growth factors are then released into the CSF. And then that tells the brain different signals and gives the neurons different signals of what to do. So imagine like when you're growing, right? And like the internal world, the internal lake was like the ocean, and you're dropping information into the ocean, and the ocean is bringing it to the shore. And then the shore knows what to do with it because the shore is responding to how the ocean is bringing the information to the brain. Right. So if I drop something here, it gets disseminated in the fluid. The fluid now can expand. It can bring it to the entire brain simultaneously without any synapses or any any blockages. So it's very dynamic. It's got very, very specific growth factors that can provide information, nutrition to the brain. It has a niche it creates a niche for stem cells, and it's very dynamic. So those are some of the things that we found. The research that came out after I finished my PhD was essentially that the what they discovered is something called the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is this system of what they call sort of like hidden caves, hidden caverns in the brain tissue itself. Because what we thought, right, even when I went back to the textbooks, is like the CSF is in the ventricles, it's in the hollow cavities, it's in the cavities of the brain, and it's outside the brain. But there's not much mix between the brain and like the brain and the ventricles. What we found from our analysis of the fluid itself was that there were a lot of intracellular, there were a lot of extracellular matrix proteins in the fluid itself. And so instantaneously, what I thought was, this fluid is it's like a fluid extracellular matrix. So what the extracellular matrix is the matrix of fluid that's outside the cells that is creating the tissues. Right? When we pulled out just the fluid, what we saw was that there was a lot of these extracellular matrix proteins, but they were fluid. They were like in fluid form as opposed to in more matrix form. So what I called it, right, was like a liquid. So the cerebrospinal fluid is this liquid extracellular matrix, this liquid crystalline matrix that was in liquid form. And then as it went into the tissues, it became more, it became more substantial, let's say, more differentiated, more palpable as a let's say as a fluid or a tissue. And so then they found the lymphatic system, and so there's these openings in the brain tissue itself. So under certain states, and this is where the research is ongoing. Under certain states, the tissue in the brain actually opens up. Imagine like a gate system kind of like opens up in the brain, and the fluid flows into the brain tissue itself. In doing so, what it does is, as it's flowing into the brain tissue itself, it's cleaning out all the toxins that are built up in the brain just through normal metabolism that occur through our lives. Daily, just daily use of our brain. And the first sort of mechanism that this happens in that they found was sleep. During sleep, when we're in states of sleep, this brain tissue can open up and the fluid can flow into the tissues. It cleans out the toxins, and then you wake up and your brain essentially has been washed. Totally washed, clean, crystal, beautiful, right? And so then now you can sort of see, oh, wow, okay, that's important. Why? Because we do want to get rid of toxins, right? It's sort of a natural waste disposal. But now we're looking at, well, what if you can't clean those toxins? What if the flow of this system isn't adequate? What happens then? So you start getting buildup, you start getting pressure increases, you start getting all these toxins build up. And now the theory is that if we don't have this adequate flow, that we're actually sort of predisposing ourselves to neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, even things like migraines, headaches, depression, because we're not actually able to clean the toxins from the brain. And so now imagine it, right? Imagine like you have a fluid system in the middle of your spine, in the middle of your brain, and it's like a river, right? If the river is not flowing, you're gonna get gunk, building up in the river. You're gonna get algae. It's gonna start smelling, yucky. There's gonna be bugs and stuff like that coming into the river. If you put a dam, right, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're blocking it up. Right? So imagine like now we don't have these mechanisms in place that allow this flow to go. And so purely scientifically, right, we need we need this flow to be occurring, to be cleaning out the toxins in the brain. That's that that is very sort of hardcore science based. Now we're seeing that, is it only in sleep? All right. Well, it turns out it's not, it's not only in sleep. Now what people are doing is, the hypotheses essentially are, well, we need to get this fluid to flow, right? If we get the fluid to flow, then we're gonna clean out the brain better. So now people are looking at different ways of having this fluid flow, including things like strobe lights, for instance, increasing the visual cortex by, looking at blinking lights, ultrasound. So a directed ultrasound into the brain tissue can increase the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid through this lymphatic system. And many people have looked at even parasympathetic states and different types of breathing exercises, for instance. So we have a just very basic. The autonomic nervous system would be one side would be the sympathetic, the other one would be the parasympathetic, very, very basic. The fight or flight system is the sympathetic, the rest and digest system is the parasympathetic. And many of us are super stressed. And so we're in a very sympathetically driven state. And the nervous system is just like anything that we can exercise. It learns through repetition. And so if we constantly are repeating ourselves in a stress cycle, then the nervous system that's going to get good is going to be the sympathetic nervous system. You're going to be really good at stressing yourself out. Importantly, that's important because, as hunter-gatherers, or if you need to respond to a stressful situation, you need to activate that nervous system. But it's overactive. And so if it's overactive, we're either stressed all the time, we have high blood pressure, heart rate's increased, stress hormones are flowing through the body, and we're not able to even, we can't sleep, we can't digest our foods, many different things. And so we're not activating the parasympathetic nervous system enough. And if we activate the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's more of the rest and digest, so we need to decrease stress. We need to do things actively to decrease stress. Well, what they've shown is that by increasing the parasympathetic nervous system, this rest and digest nervous system, that more fluid actually from the cerebrospinal fluid can get into the tissues, into the spinal cord, and also into the brain. And so, and then we've looked at, well, how does this fluid actually move, right? Like, what are the mechanisms of its moving? And we know that, for instance, the heartbeat moves the fluid. So now you're looking at, well, wow, so the heartbeat, so the way that the heart beats actually is moving the fluid. That makes sense. And then our breath. The breath can actually move the fluid. And so what the research has shown is when you inhale, when you take an in-breath, the fluid comes up into your third ventricle. Literally, they have shown it's like as you inhale from all the way down to your sacrum, all the way down from your sacrum to your third ventricle, the fluid comes into your third ventricle. So you're bringing it up to the brain when you take a deep inhale. You're bringing it up to the brain. Now even, people like Wim Hof are talking about the fluid, bring the cerebrospinal fluid up to the brain and get it into the, into the hemispheres and clean out your brain. When you exhale from like mid heart level or, belly button, sort of sacral plexus down, the fluid actually goes down to the sacrum. So inhale up throughout your whole spine and brain into the third ventricle, and they can actually see in the third ventricle this little almost like a jet of when we inhale, almost a jet into the third ventricle. And then when we exhale from like our belly down into the sacrum, right? So now, this is where you come in, because you've probably been doing these breathing exercises for years. You probably know many people that have doing these breathing exercises for millennia. You probably know people who have been also activating their perineal floor or doing different yoga postures or activating their bandhas or, chakras as they're doing these breathing exercises. So now, now you can imagine almost like, and I'm sure you've probably done this intuitively, is you're actually creating a pump. You're actually creating a flow. Not only are you creating a flow with your breath, but you're also creating a flow by activating the perineal floor, by squeezing your perineal floor when you are breathing in, right? So now just imagine, right? Now we're bringing in the science with a little bit of ancient practices, right? So now you think of like pranayama breathing, right? Holotropic breath work, any sort of breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, how that has actually, not only does the breathing activate the parasympathetic nervous system itself, but also how this breathing then brings this fluid up into the brain, starts this sort of triggers the circulatory processes in the third ventricle, gets that river flowing. Right now, the fluid is actually going more into our tissues. We're getting the opening. We don't even know, and this is again one of the hypotheses, as that jet of stream comes into the third ventricle, right? Many hypotheses are, oh, that's when then the pineal gland gets activated, because the pineal gland is in the back of the third ventricle. And so now imagine, right, the shore and ocean analogy. Now there's a jet stream coming into the third ventricle, and your pineal gland, which is a tissue that's in the third ventricle, the tissue is literally getting massaged by the fluid that's moving in the third ventricle, right? With you bringing the fluid up, and then it gets dispersed into the brain. So, you inhale, and as you inhale, you activate the perineal floor, or you do a little Kegel exercise, right? And then you hold that. And then as you exhale, you release. The fluid goes down into the sacrum. As you inhale, then same thing, right? Bring it up, do a little Kegel exercise, maybe activate the solar plexus, create this movement of energy up the spine. And some people can even describe it as, these energy locks, where they're bringing up the energy slowly, and they can lock it so it doesn't come back down. Right. So that's not my specialty. That might be, there's a number of other people that I've talked to, and that's not my specialty. But just seeing this right now, kind of bridging that science and spirituality of this Kundalini energy being dormant in the sacrum, and how breath work or movement or dance or song or anything that you could imagine that starts to kind of vibrate or bring a different frequency to the fluid itself. Breath is an amazing practice of just starting to get that fluid to start pumping, right? And then you can add anything, you can add movement, dance, vibration, singing bowls, Tibetan bowl, whatever it might be, tuning forks. And now you see this as this, this sort of super dynamic fluid that not only we know moves, but, and that's just cleaning the brain, right? Now we can say, well, what else does this fluid, what else are these vibrations and resonances bringing? What other quote unquote information could they be bringing to the body, or holding in it, that as we get this fluid to actually flow and move and resonate, that we're actually bringing those vibrations and resonances to the tissues themselves, or even just simply you're bringing it into your third ventricle and you're activating the pineal gland in the back. And now you have this, kind of all chemical reaction that happens in the pineal, in the third ventricle, because you've activated the pineal gland, you're activating this fluid. The fluid is actually going into the brain tissue itself, bathing all the brain tissue, while your pituitary gland and your thalamus and your hypothalamus, which are right on the walls of the third ventricle, are also being active. And now you have this sort of all chemical reaction in the third ventricle, and poof, awakening or enlightenment, or, a Kundalini experience has occurred. So that's where we really bridge. You can see kind of where we bridge the science, right? We know that by breathing, we can actually bring this fluid up into the third ventricle. We know that by activating parasympathetic states, we can bring this fluid into the brain tissue itself. We know anatomically that there's the pineal gland, there's the pituitary gland, there's the thalamus and the hypothalamus, right? And then we link it into the practices that have been done and say, hey, look, anatomically, physiologically, this could be the perfect medium that is actually housing this Kundalini energy. That through these practices, we're activating it. We can bring it up the spine. We can bring it into the third ventricle. We can bring it into our crown, and really create that holistic experience throughout our entire being. Because not only are we affecting the tissues, not only are we affecting the fluid, the tissues, but if we look at it from a purely physical fluid perspective, all the water molecules in the cerebrospinal fluid, and all the water molecules then connecting with the rest of the body. So you can see how really that cerebrospinal fluid, both anatomically and physically and physiologically, could be the medium for the Kundalini energy to be transmitted through.
Absolutely fascinating. And it makes so much sense. It makes so much sense. Of course, I am practicing, as we spoke before, I am doing these pranayama techniques for years. I've learned them many, many years ago. It's been 17 years now. And when I work with clients, I work with these, and this is exactly what we are experiencing. But there has never been so much explanation to this. And yeah, I absolutely love it. So would you say, or could you say that from an bioenergetical perspective, that this is absolutely related?
Absolutely.
Yeah, beautiful.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, right? Because I come from it from a very different, right? I'm an N of one, let's say, but as I started talking, people started coming to me. And this is where the stories, right? Because you now hear you hear the science and you go, "Oh my God, that makes like you've had 17 years of this experiential in your body, right? Now it's exactly like people like you taking this information and bringing it to the people that have been practicing it, right? And saying, and now, right, from my perspective, and this is purely my perspective, having that, bringing the quality of consciousness, of attention to the cerebrospinal fluid allows the whole process to, it's almost like it expands the entire process. It's like there's a greater connection. There's a greater bridge, right? If we're looking at like if like how big can the cable be, right? When you're talking about like electric, like sort of like so, and that's what I'm curious about is because in my experience, when I bring in that awareness of the fluid, its connections with all the fluid in my body, its connections with the water, its connections with my amniotic fluid in the womb, right? Now these are the stories that we're trying to collect. Is people have had these experiences of, hey, I've been doing this practice for 20 years, and oh my goodness, yes, it's the fluid, right? And so collecting those stories and kind of getting it out there, because a lot of people, the uncertainty can frighten them. It can scare them a little bit. And so we'd like to share that this is a natural biological process that is in all of us. And learning how to have a relationship with it is important. And so I'm curious, for like with this work of getting it out there and bringing that quality of attention to the cerebrospinal fluid, just by saying hello to it, just by saying, I see you, you've been doing these practices, you know what you feel authentically inside. And now you say, wow, anatomically now I know this. physiologically, I know it does this. Fascinating. Okay. As you're doing these practices, right? Now you just connect to the cerebrospinal fluid just by saying hello to it. Hello. Hello, CSF. I see you. And, and see just by bringing that element of consciousness to it, what that does to then your, your connection, your experience, your wisdom that you're building inside of you.
Absolutely. And I do believe what it does when we have this knowledge and we are so mind-based. When we've grown up in the West, we are just through school, through all the educational system, we have just learned to always needing to explain everything. And what we just do, we just remove this one layer of resistance when we're not quite sure of something. And when we have an explanation that makes sense to us in a logical sense, there's just like so much more space for surrender and ease and the parasympathetic to turn on again, right? Yeah.
Yes. Beautifully said. Wow. Totally. Absolutely. And and I love that. It's like it removes even the slightest layer of like questioning, right? That or resistance. That can be removed now, and it's almost like, oh, I can rest in this, right? Um, and so that's why I started doing the work, because at the end of the day, people ask me, like what is this? And I said, look, I just want to bring people to be aware of the cerebrospinal fluid, that they have the cerebrospinal, and that's it, right?
So much already.
Everything else, it will take care of itself, right? Just bring your attention. Know that you have cerebrospinal fluid in the middle of your brain, the middle of your spinal cord that's bathing. Know that this is what it does scientifically, but just like, and just say hello to it, and that's it. And then the rest will take care of itself. And recognizing, right? Because recognizing that um, you may be feeling something, you may be having an experience, right? That is not yet quote unquote described, that is not yet quote unquote explained by science. But what we're finding out now about the breath and the body and the movement of the CSF, 1,000 years ago, they could have never imagined that we were even thinking or talking about these sorts of movements and flows, because we didn't have the technology, right? And so now when I post certain things, it's really interesting, because the majority of people will say, "Oh, thank God that the science is, we knew this all along. Thank God that the science is," and it does. It decreases that resistance that still might be present, but it's still, people are feeling this. We're experiential beings, right? We're sensate beings. People are feeling this. Just because it hasn't been described yet doesn't mean that it's not real. And that's where we hold that hypothesis. We're not hubris about it, or we're not, oh, I know what it is and don't tell me anything else. No, you're completely open and curious about the possibilities of what it may be, right? But in your data collection of your N of one, this has been consistent. It has it or has it not, right? That's your little personal investigation and personal journey. And that's what I think is really beautiful. And yet, and throughout the process, staying as grounded as you can, staying as embodied as you can, having a resource, being resourced, having a place where, if you feel like you're going into an uncomfortable, experience, that you can come out of it, that you can have a place that you can direct your attention to, that you can hold on to, whatever it might be, that brings you into a safer place, right? And I think that's important as well.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So then coming to these more extreme experiences that many have with the Kundalini awakening, let's say, what would be a physiological explanation of a spontaneous awakening where a lot of energy bursts up at once? Um, is this maybe due to really a physiological blockage release? in the spinal cord, or yeah, something else? And how would you make the connection to these initial clearings that we are experiencing in this awakening?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the spontaneous, one could imagine that there's different reasons for that, and it's not just going to be one. It will not be just one reason. So yes, a blockage, absolutely. I've been working with some chiropractors, for instance. People might have blockages in the neck from car accidents that they were involved in when they were young, traumas that they may have been involved in, energetic blockages of the heart, where even stress that the fluid is not able to flow. I'm making connections now with chiropractors that are doing high cervical manipulations of people to try to get the fluid to flow better, and things like that. So blockages is definitely a possible one. The most the most likely is, from my like, would be a shift in the frequency of the fluid, a shift in the energetics of the fluid. And you can see whether it's things like cinematics or, when you look at fluid waves, you can be in a situation, for instance, where your whole life the fluid has been resonating at a certain frequency. And then you go into a different situation, and instantaneously your entire body, the entire fluid system shifts energetically, frequency wise. That could be a spontaneous, where from the cerebrospinal fluid you get an instantaneous shift in the frequency of the cerebrospinal fluid. And because it transmits information, that instantaneous frequency can lead to pineal gland activation, but pituitary gland, thalamus, hypothalamus, all simultaneously, because you're in the middle of, like, it's connected with it all, and the spinal cord and the outside of the brain. So instantaneously you can get this activation just by changing the frequency of the fluid. Now, some people might see it as a spontaneous, but I'm always curious of what have they done in the previous weeks or months or days that may have actually allowed them to be a little bit more parasympathetic, be a little bit more rest and digest, be a little bit more open to the to various energies or frequencies, or even thought patterns that are coming through. As we look at the research in water, for instance, and water, there's some research that suggests that water can go into a fourth phase, which is it's very interesting. And so the cerebrospinal fluid being 99% water, one of the hypotheses that we're trying to test is, can the cerebrospinal fluid go into a fourth phase too? And essentially, what it is under under certain conditions, and they've shown it with, like, infrared light, that the water can go into a fourth phase, and it almost becomes like an internal battery, right? Because it removes charged particles, and so you get a relative area of plus and minus. And anytime you have a relative area of plus and minus, you have the potential of an electrical charge being created. Some people actually feel is going on, right? Maybe it's something suddenly happen, where instantaneously they go into the cerebrospinal, the fluid itself becomes a battery and can create an electrical charge, and you feel that.
Mm.
That's a hypothesis that I mean, we're testing all these hypotheses, but that's a hypothesis that we're also testing in terms of all the information that's coming out with water, information from Veda Austin's work and research on water holding memory, and things like that. And so, that's probably like that's kind of high on our list, but you've got to think that in order for this to happen smoothly, we need those, we'd like any of those blockages to be cleared, right? We'd like any, whether it's physical blockages or emotional blockages or energetic blockages or anything like that. I know for me, I had a huge solar plexus blockage, and clearing that with the practices of meditation, mindfulness, movement, breath work, body work, slowly started to clear that blockage. And once that blockage was clear, then it was like before it was I felt something and it was like it was just like closing off instantaneously. So, and looking at that from now, right, if you look at whether it's a resonance frequency or an energy or water going into the fourth phase, there is an energetic component that comes in that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to go into the fourth phase. So then the next hypothesis is then that's the connection to then the physiologic connection to the universe, right? Whether you're talking about Schumann's resonance or you're talking about I'm entering into a room and there's another person in that room, that person has a resonance frequency, I'm resonating at a frequency, or a crystal bowl or a light, right? Or whatever it might be. And so then that, right, through that connection with that energetic connection with the fluid, now the fluid is responding to the energy in the room, in the universe. And that's where for me, even if you take the water molecule, right? So for me, like the meditations I do are like, it's like right, the first one, level one is finding your resource, finding a place you can go to, a safe place, recognizing emotions, sensations, thoughts and things like that can arise, developing this quality of interoception. So there's a process that I take people before getting to the cerebrospinal fluid. But once it's the cerebrospinal fluid, it's like I said, becoming curious about it, saying hello to it, et cetera, et cetera. But then even within the cerebrospinal fluid, then we can go to the whole fluid, and then we can go from the whole fluid, right, anatomically to the fluid everywhere. So then it just becomes fluid, right? So I've always wanted somebody to like depict an image of the human body as just fluid, right? No muscles, no, and see what that actually looks like. It'd be the exact same image as what you see. But then from the fluid, go to the water. From the water, then go to the hydrogen and the oxygen. From the hydrogen and the oxygen, then go to the electrons that are actually making up the hydrogen and water and oxygen, right? And then from the electrons, going to the vibrations of the electrons and actually noticing and the circulate. And then, right, from that, now you ask yourself, oh, who am I? And that it's like from the fluid, from the cerebrospinal fluid, to the water, to the electron, then universally, now I'm connected to everything, right? So it's an instantaneous bridge when you go to that kind of quantum level to everything through the fluid. And that is a process that somebody could do while still being embodied. So that's sort of like, to me, is not only the spontaneous awakening, spontaneous Kundalini rising, but then also the sort of a scientific explanation of the connection to the felt sense of a connection to everything, to the universe at large, through through this energetic relationship that we are all having with all the resonances and frequencies that are occurring in the atmosphere, in the room that we're in, and then they become more condensed based on what is present, right? I can ding a ringing bowl, and all of a sudden that resonance becomes more powerful. I can walk into a room with somebody, that resonance becomes more powerful, right? And so, and we're doing this constantly, right? And so there's this constant sort of dance that we're having with this energy, and that to me, but also, you know, also the universe as a whole. So through that process, then it's a direct connection of connected to source in divine energy, whatever you want to call it, and pure physical form and back again. So it's a two-way, it's not different. It's just an energy, and it's two ways. It's a two-way highway. It's a download and it's an upload, and it's continuously. And that, then you can have a relationship with that as well. And again, consciously, as we bring conscious attention and awareness to this, then that bridge can increase in time, because that's what we're actually educating our beings to be oriented towards, if that makes sense. That was a
Makes
bit out there.
sense than ever before.
What's that?
Everything makes so much more sense than ever before.
Okay. I'm like, you know, so sometimes I go off on these and I'm like, did I lose it or not? But like, that's kind of, that for me is like really the bridging of the science and the spirituality. And you know, and again, asking what am I orienting to? What is my vantage point? Right? Because what's cool is we can choose. We can be conscious of that and choose it. And again, doing this from a resource place where you have a place that you can go to that's safe, and doing it with an open curiosity, like a joyful curiosity of, you know, let's go frolic in the field together. You have no idea where you're going to find in the field, but let's go. Right? And that's it's beautiful. It's just it's divine. You know, that's it. Like, so.
All right, then I have one last question. I could ask questions forever, I bet, but one last one about the Amrita,
Yeah.
the nectar that some of us could taste coming from our work or
Yeah,
from.
so, you know, that's an interesting question. And there's a very specific practice. It's called the Kachari Mudra. And it's a practice that is believed to bring immortality. It's believed to sort of bring gurus or people who can do this practice, you know, the sense of immortality. And it's a practice where you take your tongue and you bring it. If you feel the top of your palate, you have a hard palate, and it's called hard because there's a bone there. And then some people can feel it's almost like as if you're taking your tongue and you're putting it all the way back to the roof of your mouth. Then there's the soft palate, and the bone kind of disappears, and you have tissue. This is a practice that has been done for millennia, and it's called the Kachari Mudra, and it's where you take your tongue, and with practice, you loosen the tissues of your tongue, and you bring it behind the soft palate. And when you go behind the soft palate, you can actually take the tongue and put it from your oral cavity into your nasal cavity. So you're kind of bringing it up into the nasal cavity. Again, I don't do this practice, and you know, some people have said that I guess in doing the practice, you can, you know, if you don't do it correctly, you can choke or something like that. You can swallow your tongue. Many yogis do it. I know a lot of people have contacted me who do the practice very safely. So, you know, if you are interested, you know, look up all the parameters in terms of how to do it and stuff like that. But There's a so when your tongue is in the nasal cavity, um, you massage the upper part of your nasal cavity, and in the upper part of your nasal cavity, when you look or anatomically, is your olfactory bulb. This is where the neurons, the nerves that come out from your skull, from your brain, come out. And when we, when we smell things like whatever we smell, the molecules from the essential oil is released into the air, and then it goes up into our nasal passages, and it goes and it binds these receptors on on these olfactory nerves that are coming through it's called the cribriform plate. And that's how, so then that nerve gets activated by a molecule that's in the air, and then that information gets sent to the brain, which tells us this is the smell that it is, whatever it is. Anyways, when we massage that area of the brain, um, anatomically, we might actually be massaging the cribriform plate. We might actually be massaging these olfactory nerves that are coming down. Right? Okay, so we're taking the smell in, and the molecules from whatever we're smelling is going up into our nose, and it's making contact with the nerves, and then those nerves then get sent into that information then that gets sent into our brain, and we're told, this is a peppermint or cayenne or whatever it might be. At that area, this is where it's believed that the people who do this practice are actually massaging that area. And when you massage that area, this is an area where the cerebrospinal fluid actually can come through the cribriform plate. So anatomically, when you massage that area, what you might be actually doing is massaging that area and sort of allowing some of the cerebrospinal fluid to drip through the cribriform plate onto your tongue. And that's when the masters of this practice have called that sacred nectar, the sacred nectar of immortality, when the practice is done correctly. And there's sort of this sweet taste that comes from it, and it's believed to when that happens, it's believed to sort of bring immortality, or the sense of immortality, have higher connections to spirit, source, maybe even have higher sort of psychic abilities and stuff like that. Well, the Amrit or Amrita, that is this sacred nectar of immortality, could very well be the cerebrospinal fluid. And that would, that's kind of interesting too, in terms of like, here's this practice that has been done for millennia. This, you massage the upper nasal passages, you get this fluid, some nectar flowing down, which there's only one nectar that can actually be flowing down, which is the cerebrospinal fluid. And, these gurus or yogis calling it the Amrita or Amrit, and being the sacred nectar of immortality. It's so powerful for me that our third daughter, her name is Amrita.
Mm.
And when we say that, and when she is the sacred nectar. And that, it's like the CSF, Amrita, everything just kind of, sacred nectar of immortality just kind of perfectly makes sense. So that would be the Amrita or Amrit connection with the cerebrospinal fluid.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Very round story.
Okay.
Yeah, wow. So I have no more questions for you so far. I just really gotta digest all of this now.
Okay. Let me, just keep in touch, because I love how you're bridging it, right? Now you're like whatever you're gonna synthesize this from your 17 years of experience and then bring it to your
Exactly.
people, right? And so for me, that's the connection that I love then to show others, right? So like in 2 months from now, if you could digest this, or 3 months, and then almost if I could interview you of like what have you done, right? How have you brought this from your practice and your experience into the world? Because I think that's really, that to me that's beautiful. So um, I'd love to hear your experience of it in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, whatever you think is authentic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would love that.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you so, so much.
Yeah, I'm happy we were finally able to connect. Sorry about all the time stuff, and I've done that too. I've actually Googled the same, and then I'm like, wait, Google said it was 7. And they're like, yeah, but we're on daylight saving, and it didn't take that into account. I'm like, oh, whatever. Okay.
We made it. Amazing. Thank you so much. And yes, I hope we speak very soon
Okay.
again. I'm sure I have a lot of more questions.
Beautiful. All
Okay.
right. Okay.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.